I've been here from September, so if you want to know anything at all about Kennedy School, obviously I'm the person to talk to with fresh eyes, all of that. And I'm with Kathryn Sikkink, who is the new Bryan Family Chair of Professor of Human Rights. And in the interest of full disclosure, we've also been married for 34 years. So just in case you see a little bit of funny communication, you'll know that it's not illicit. Regrettably, our third colleague, Siddharth Kara, was not able to come today because of a medical emergency. He's in Los Angeles. Siddharth is the Kara Center's director of trafficking, human trafficking, and contemporary forms of slavery. He's also an adjunct lecturer here at Kennedy School. So I'm going to try and fill in the gap a little bit for Siddharth, because I think it's a really exciting and very interesting program that he's running. So our topic is making human rights work. Many people think of human rights as a set of norms and principles embodied in treaties, and especially at our law schools, thankfully, in more and more places around the world, those treaties are being understood and being debated and are influencing national legislation. But our interest at Kennedy School is not so much what those norms are, but rather how do we make them effectual in the world? How do we make these human rights actually work to protect vulnerable peoples and to promote the promises of human rights in their everyday lives? So we're going to focus on three topics today that we're engaged in at the Kara Center for Human Rights. The first will be the issue of torture, and then trafficking and trials. Obviously, we chose these because they all started with T. We have other programs, but they didn't start with T. First of all, I want to just think a bit about what the Kara Center for Human Rights is, who we are, what we do. So the mission of the Kara Center, which was established in 1998, is, of course, as part of the Kennedy School, is to train future leaders in public policy issues, but specifically in human rights, and to make human rights principles central to good public policy in the United States and around the world. We also want to train future leaders for their careers in public service, specifically in the fields of human rights, and to, very importantly, apply first-class research into the resolution of human rights problems. That's our mission. We're really focusing on two ways of approaching that at this point. And the first is, of course, to understand the needs of practitioners in the field, understand leaders, understand grassroots people, understand international people, and what they need. And why would they come to the Kennedy School? In order to renew themselves, to build their skills. And as we understand those, then our purpose is to help them think more strategically and to act more strategically in their work. And secondly, to draw on the best social science research. The key issue is that in the past, human rights was largely ignored by international relations, by political science, by social science in general. But over the last 15 or 20 years, there's been an increasing attention to understanding the causes of human rights, which help us think, therefore, about the solutions, to understanding the conditions under which certain approaches have worked to make change in the past, and therefore also affect our strategic thinking. And even more recently, especially thanks to Kathryn's work, to begin measuring the effect of certain kinds of policies or tactics and how they are making a difference on human rights issues. So the importance here is to be able to draw on Harvard and draw on the Kennedy Center to understand and encourage good social science research so that it can be used to engage practitioners in the field and help them do their work more effectively, that the courage that they show is also backed by the best thinking possible. Yeah, that's where I'm going next. Trafficking. That's the first issue of the day. And as I said, our program is run by Siddharth Kara. This is Siddharth in a small shop run by a juju witchcraft person in Nigeria, where girls are trafficked for sexual use by the priest, a ritual that's supposed to help purify the family. And he is documenting this, as he has done in 30 other countries around the world, looking at different kinds of human trafficking. This, for example, is a group of brothel workers in Nepal. I just wanted to read to you what Siddharth would have started his presentation with, and which certainly when I met him, he described this as well. He says, "I will never forget the first trafficked sex slave I met. She was 14 years old in a brothel in Bombay and was being brutalized numerous times a day by grown men. Though her heart was still beating, she looked as if she was already dead. She was poor, illiterate, and had lost all hope. In many ways, she was the face of contemporary civilization's greatest shame, the failure to protect our children from brutal enslavement." So, human trafficking has been a term widely employed, but important to understand that we're really talking about contemporary forms of slavery. And in that, when we're looking at human trafficking, we're looking at the recruitment by force, by coercion, or by fraud, the abduction and the transport of women, children, and men to be exploited in conditions of forced labor. This often involves slave-like conditions in almost every stream of the global economy. So human trafficking has become so pervasive and so widespread that it's really arisen to one of the major human rights topics of the day. It also overlaps with a number of other human rights issues, such as torture, international security, terrorism, migration, gender equality, children's rights, and even public health. But these efforts to address trafficking have really been mired in ineffectiveness thus far, because they really haven't been addressed on a strategic level. They have gotten a great deal of attention on certain kind of research, but not a strategic approach to resolve it. One of the things I like so much about Siddharth's approach in his research is to look at this as a supply chain problem. And therefore, as it goes up and down the supply chain to see where and how it operates, he also has the opportunity to look at potential vulnerabilities and targets for intervention. And that brings something new. Let's start with tainted carpets. This is Siddharth's latest piece of research. And it is the largest first-hand research program in history on forced labor in contemporary times. And specifically, he was testing the statements by the government of India that children were no longer involved in the production of hand-knotted carpets in India, and of course by the industry as well. So he conducted a very extensive research program. He had a team of local researchers that he trained, They documented the entire production zone of carpets of northern India in 9 states and thousands of locations. And they traced that production through its entire supply chain, all the way into American retail stores. The conditions were exacting and antagonistic and often dangerous. Now, was India right that there was no children involved? They say a picture is worth 1,000 words. These children work 10 to 12 hours a day in this room. They work 6 or 7 days a week. And Siddharth and his team were there to monitor that, pretending to be someone else. But what's more, the children sleep here on the ground. They eat here. Everything in their lives is confined to this space. And all of their working or wait time is involved in hand knotting carpets. So the research findings were, first of all, that about 45% of the handmade carpets in India involve some kind of forced labor, indentured servitude, and other debt bondage and so forth. But that fully 25% of those carpets of India are made by children. We found that nearly all of the people trafficked into this industry come from ethnic minorities and low castes. They're very heavily children and women, and their average daily work is, again, 10 or 12 hours a day. Falling through the supply chain, he found these rugs being sold in some of the major retail stores of America and of Europe. And he documents these quite well. Now, when he published the report, which we have copies available for you back here, the manufacturer called Harvard's legal attorney and threatened to sue. So you won't find the names of those companies in this report because the attorney forced us to take those names out. But these companies, on the other hand, didn't threaten to sue. Instead, they called Siddharth and asked for help on how to design a program that would guarantee that the carpets that they sold would not be tainted by child or forced labor. And so a conversation has begun and an attempt to begin looking at the protections that a company that wants to act in good faith can put into effect in order to assure that its products are safe and made according to the best human rights principles. So in this field, our strategy is to create very data-driven research projects and research conclusions in order to influence public policy, in order to influence the policy of the corporate world as well. And we're going to continue looking at other forms or other commodities where forced labor is being used. It could be shrimp production in Vietnam. It could be, well, a whole number of things. Suddenly my mind's gone blank. It happens this way.
Tile.
We did a thing on tile in Mexico. And as I said, he's been operating in 30 countries. This project was funded by Google. And they gave it sufficient resources that they could proudly say that they were responsible for the largest and most thorough study of modern slavery. I'm going to go to our next issue, which is torture. And I'm really sorry to say, in fact, I was depressed to say that the decision by the United States to use forms of cruelty and torture as part of its war on terror have really made the situation of torture much more complicated and much worse, as reported by people in the field, where now governments are less prone to hide what they do and more prone to justify their behavior because it's what the United States did. But we're not going to talk about that specifically today, but I do want to talk at the end about a project that we're doing about the U.S. Use of cruelty, and very happy to discuss that with you. I don't know, well, my background is this, and I came to the Kennedy School having built the Center for Victims of Torture in Minneapolis. It was the first treatment center in the United States for torture survivors, founded by the governor of the state, with the mission of healing the wounds of torture, not only on the individuals, but their families and their communities, to build an expertise in this area with a very multidisciplinary staff of psychologists and social workers and psychiatrists and physicians and researchers. And in my time at CDT for 24 years, we provided care to over 21,000 survivors of torture from 72 countries, I believe. And when I left, we operated in 6 other countries with direct care and 25 other countries in supporting the development of treatment centers there. So I say with no little trepidation that I consider myself an expert on torture, what it is, what it looks like, what its effects are. And I'm due really to walk into a conversation at the Kennedy School on Monday with someone speaking here from the CIA about enhanced interrogation. I need to call on my greatest skills of calmness to have a Kennedy-like conversation on about something I think America should never have started. But that's the opportunity at the Kennedy School, is to see many different kinds of people and have a conversation with them. But at any rate, one of the things that we learned in our time at the center was that torture has not largely responded to the traditional tactics of the human rights movement. Traditionally, human rights organizations are known for developing standards, be they treaties or laws or sets of formal guidelines that should guide the activities of corporations or companies. But it's norm development. Secondly, of course, once you have those norms, is to monitor them to see whether or not they're being abided by. And there have been more activities monitoring torture than any other issue, single issue of human rights. The third is basically to name and shame, as it's called, to publicize those countries and governments and other actors who are violating those norms, and make them publicly visible as a way of creating moral leverage for them to change. But unfortunately, torture remains widespread. And there are also many other kinds of human rights issues that don't respond to those 3 tactics. Now, the problem is that a narrow set of tactics actually constrains an organization's ability to think strategically. It's the old problem of when your only tool is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. So that's one of the reasons here at the Card Center, we're putting such emphasis on the tools of building strategy for the human rights community. And part of that tool means to expand their understanding of tactics that are available, but also how to mix them together so that they are effectively used. Now, this is just to illustrate both a strength and a weakness of the human rights movement. I hope all of you are members of Amnesty International. I've been since the mid-70s. I love the organization, and at the same time I know many of its limits. And so Amnesty started by asking people to write letters on behalf of political prisoners in Portugal, and write letters to the president of Portugal. And in the process, they discovered people would do that, and they used that as a method then to build a large membership base, for which they need to be congratulated and emulated, because they're the only major human rights organization that's actually built a constituency for human rights. But it also is a constraint, because they have limited many of their tactics to those that their members can perform, and they've limited themselves because their first priority is to constantly stimulate their members. So it becomes a bit of a trap, where the important question then becomes, where is our target for these letters or for the other kinds of communications that they urge their members to make? Everyone following me on that? So the traditional issue, of course, is again to target the president. But in order to be effective, we have to kind of think like Siddharth does about the supply chain. What actually happens along the line in order to effect change, for example, of the use of torture at a police station someplace in Turkey. Well, you know, many of you are involved in the corporate world and government world, and you're in charge. What do? You pass it along to your deputy. In this case, the Minister of the Interior. And so if the president is actually motivated by the letter, and he makes a command to the Interior Minister, because that's what the police are, the Interior Minister, of course, then assigns it to his deputy, who then assigns it to the National Commissioner, and then the District Police Commander. And what I'm trying to illustrate is the logic of the way bureaucracies work, is that you can see the force of the order from the president diminishing at each level and scattering down when you get to the police, meaning basically that by targeting the president and by not figuring out how to reinforce the president's push further down the chain, that the tactic becomes weak in terms of its ability to act. And it also doesn't take into consideration that every level there's pushback. Even in a command control situation, the commander has to listen to the people below and will hear the bickering. Oh no, we need to do this to get information. Oh, you want us to solve problems and solve crimes, but the only way we can do it is reading confessions from people. So there's pushback, all of which means it works against that particular tactic. But nonetheless, it is a powerful resource to have these if we can figure out how to make them more effective. So one tool that we used to try and reimagine the terrain on which human rights issues are fought is what we call tactical mapping. This is a tactical map here. And it's the first one that was developed. And what's different about this approach is that rather than beginning conceptually out on the outskirts toward the president and making a guess about what effect this tactic might have, we're trying to visualize the relationships in which a human rights problem is embedded. And if we can visualize and understand those relationships, then we can figure out new ways of putting pressure closer to the target rather than further away. Where secondly, once we design and develop the diagram of relationships, we look at the nature of the relationships and we use it to track, we use it both to choose targets and to track our impact as we move through these various causal chains in order to more astutely and accurately measure our effectiveness in making change. And finally, our conclusion in this whole process was that no organization can do this on its own. It cannot make changes on its own because the system is highly complex. And if, like Amnesty, we're going through only one part of the system and only affecting that, all the other parts of the system, the judiciary, and other elements of society that benefit, say, from the use of torture, help maintain the system until the attack has been dissipated, essentially. So if you instead imagine a series of those causal chains, if the president had also turned to the Judiciary Department and to the Health Department and the Defense Department, and each had those chains, all of them present different opportunities for intervention in the system. Now, this is essentially what we do. We begin in the center of the map in a country and say, here's our target. In this case, we're looking at a victim of torture and his torture in a highly particular place. We call it a torture chamber. In most places, it's a police station. Sometimes it's a military force. We ask the question, who surrounds this and helps make it possible? We know from social science research that tortures really only exist as part of a team. These are the Milgram studies, among other things. So it's important when you start thinking about this, how do you interrupt the process, not just of an individual, but of a team? We know, though, that there were other people in the police department. There's other police, there's a police captain, but there's also the cleaner, the secretary, who may be sources of information, and there's also usually a doctor who comes in order to evaluate the condition of the prisoner. In many places, that's quite formal, especially where torture has been widely used. But those doctors are generally also threatened not to report the truth. So we know the doctor's there. We also know that the prosecuting attorney will come in to be part of that and have a relationship. The judge will be there, and eventually a representing lawyer. So we know that the system gets a little more complex, but in its complexity gives us new possible places to intervene. For example, the medical doctor has relationships with the medical association. Can we do anything with that? There are treatment doctors in many societies now. How do we do that? And of course, we can't ignore that both the victim and the perpetrator's family, friends, and social network are those sources of changing norms in society. And as we build this tactical map and others, we're following the chain all the way into the relationships into the international community, where, like Amnesty International, initiates a tactic, other organizations have initiated tactics far afield, attempting to have an impact on the center. So this is how we go about tactical mapping, and we're looking at the nature of relationships in it. Are they command-control relationships, relationships of influence, and so forth. I'm going to just zip through this and then say, what do we do with this? Well, I developed a program in Turkey with colleagues there where we brought new tactics into the mix, into the discussion of what could be done in a place like Turkey. So from Uruguay, where the Medical Association, and from Chile, where the Medical Associations disciplined doctors who were involved in torture by removing their license to practice, that tactic went to Turkey, as did a tactic of young people in Argentina who began showing up at the homes of known torturers to hold folk festivals, and in that way to inform the neighbors and the family that this is what this person did. from places like Germany, the UK, where citizens are appointed to be monitors of police stations. They're authorized to walk into a police station 24 hours a day in order to assure the community that there's no abuse going on there. From the Indian Human Rights Commission, which began to fine police officers who were involved in the use of torture, so that it was the police officer who was paying the cost of rehabilitation. And the next step, maybe even more important, he fined the police captain for not controlling his police officers. And the police station lost its budget, again, in order to pay for rehabilitation. And from Liberia, a policeman starts a policemen's association with the purpose of helping improve the police practices of investigation and so forth, but also to promote human rights among police officers. And last count, they had over 800 dues-paying Liberian policemen associated with this. We enter into a place like Turkey and begin to insert those. So the Medical Association, I'll just be quickly, the Medical Association began, first of all, to train the doctors who were going into the police station on exactly what were the signs of torture. And at the conclusion, they were able to say, look, if this happens and you don't diagnose it as falaka, beating the souls of the police, and instead you put down what the police said is he fell down the stairs, your committee malpracticed. But they also understood from you look puzzled. I always pay attention to you when you're in the room.
Yeah, you know I'm slow to catch up.
Okay. But they also heard from the forensic doctors that the police would threaten them to do something different, and they would often sit in the exam room. So the Medical Association did two other things. They created a protocol on how forensics had to be done legally and ethically, and the very first item was it needed to be done with only the prisoner and the doctor present. And so that it would be posted on the wall, and the doctor would point to it and say, look, I can't do anything if you're in this room. You have to leave. And then they also secured an agreement with the Bar Association to provide legal assistance to any doctor who was being sanctioned by the state for telling the truth. But they added also negative sanctions. And that is for doctors who continued to refuse to document human rights abuses, they removed their license to practice. They did not allow them to go to international meetings because they had to go, they could go to those only as members of good standing of the organization. So there are other tactics that we've outlined here as interventions. And rather than go into detail on those, I basically want to say that the importance here is not to look for the perfect tactic, which so often we do, and instead to start thinking about packages of tactics. How do we intervene in the system, recognizing that it's complex, pressure needs to come not just on the police, but in the judiciary, in civil society, in the media, and in the medical place. We need to intervene and learn to intervene simultaneously. And we need to quit treating complex problems as though they were simple. And what this requires fundamentally is rethinking our approach to how we work. Because normally each organization is making its intervention independent of the work of others, rather than coordinating their work together. And I would say you as donors have an important role to play in this, which is to begin not only to fund collaboration, but to demand collaboration, because literally without it, these major issues will not change. Now, as an example of an effective intervention and the importance of social science research to underscore and evaluate this kind of intervention, I'm going to turn it over to Kathryn to talk about her work on human rights trials.
Thank you. Well, first, I am Kathryn Sikkink. I am the new Ryan Family Professor of Human Rights Policy, and Ben Ryan is sitting right here in the room, and so I wanted to just personally recognize him and his family and say what a privilege it is for me to be the Ryan Family Professor here. Thank you. As Doug said, human rights trials are in fact one of the main tactics or tools that the human rights movement is now using to try to end torture, end genocide, and war crimes. But what we need to do, once we've established these arrows about which tactics are being used, then as social scientists, we need to say, do those tactics work? Now, the IDEASphere is about powerful ideas. And there's a powerful idea here, and that's the idea that people can and should be held, state officials who violated rights can and should be held criminally accountable for their actions. But we don't know, or we haven't known in the past, if that works. And so what we're trying to do at the Carr Center, and what my work has been doing in the past, and what we're now trying to do more at the Carr Center, is really try to answer that question. There's a debate out there where some scholars and some policymakers say human rights trials don't make things better. They can make things worse. They can exacerbate human rights, they can undermine democracy, and they can even cause conflict. And so that's been the purpose of my research. And as Doug explained, we don't want to just have people use trials because their trials are the hammer that they have. That's the only tactic they can think of. We want to make sure that people use trials because they know that that's an effective tactic. Now, some of the earliest human rights prosecutions took place. In other words, our goal is to measure and assess the effectiveness of human rights trials. Some of the earliest human rights prosecutions took place in Argentina in 1985 when the members of the military junta were prosecuted for disappearing and murdering thousands of Argentines, tens of thousands of Argentines, during the military dictatorship between 1976 and 1983. And this is where I first got interested in the issue of human rights prosecutions. I was a young PhD student doing my dissertation research, and I happened to be there in 1985. I was doing my research on a different topic, entirely different topic, but I was able to follow these trials, attend the trials, and really got interested in this issue of criminal accountability. Since that time, there has been what I call a justice cascade, the title of my most recent book. By that I mean that these trials have really mushroomed, and we've seen them all over the world, and many of them are not domestic prosecutions like the prosecution in Argentina that took place in the domestic judicial system of Argentina, but they're increasingly international prosecutions like this prosecution of Charles Taylor, the former president of Liberia, who is actually being tried in a special tribunal for Sierra Leone, where he and his group committed war crimes during the conflict in Sierra Leone, and he was sentenced to 50 years for those war crimes. Now, this is an example that under some circumstances, even heads of state can be held criminally accountable for human rights violations. The research questions, however, are, okay, so what effects do these human rights prosecutions have? And this research question is really important because of the debate I told you about. There are many scholars, and especially many policymakers, who say that trials are dangerous. And they say this for a couple of reasons. One, because sometimes they argue that the threat of prosecution will cause policymakers to entrench themselves in power. They won't want to give up power so they don't get prosecuted. Secondly, in situations of civil war, it may keep insurgents and governments from the peace table. And they need to come to the peace table in order to resolve the conflict that's leading to these war crimes. but they fear prosecution, so maybe they won't make a peace deal, and that can cause problems. And so these are serious concerns that people are raising. Other people, and many human rights advocates, have long argued that human rights prosecutions are necessary to deter human rights violations. In the old days, no one was prosecuted, and what it meant is that there were no costs to state officials who committed human rights violations. They could go and live in comfortable exile, maybe on the Riviera, for their remaining years when they stepped down from power. So this research is really important because it's what we need to help us make good policy recommendations to people in transitional societies or current conflict situations like Syria today. The way we did it is with the support of the National Science Foundation. I worked with a team of scholars to gather data on human rights prosecutions in 97 transitional countries around the world over a 40-year period. And we found that about 2/3 of those countries used at least once prosecutions. And what that lets us do then is to compare countries, those that used prosecutions to those that did not, in order to see the impact. What we found was that, one, that there were prosecutions in 59 countries, 481 prosecutions involving over 4,000 accused individuals. Again, the reason for that difference is because many of these prosecutions involve multiple accused individuals. You saw the slide on Argentina, the 9 junta members were tried together in a single trial. And very often these trials involve multiple perpetrators. We saw that there were verdicts in 70% of the cases, and in 57% those are guilty verdicts. Now, this is interesting for us because, one, we now know that these human rights prosecutions are not a small phenomenon limited to a few countries. They're actually very widespread. We know that these are not just kangaroo courts where either everyone is released or everyone is convicted, but they're real prosecutions where there's due process and where rule of law is at work and evidence is considered. Sometimes people are convicted, sometimes they're not convicted. In addition to gathering data on prosecutions themselves, that's the orange and pink line there, we also gathered data on amnesty laws, that's the blue line. The reason we did that was because we had also heard from some scholars and some practitioners who said, look, it's not just a justice cascade, as you say, but there's 2 trends going on here. There's an accountability trend, but there's also an impunity trend, where these amnesty laws protect people from prosecution. And those 2 trends are canceling each other out. And so what we, by gathering data on new amnesty laws, we discovered that even though many amnesty laws around the world are still in effect, that new amnesty laws are on a decline. And that does suggest that there is not just an impunity trend canceling out the justice cascade. The big question is, well, what difference does it make? Once we have this data, we then could do quantitative analysis. And again, with some very, full disclosure, I'm not the quantitative whiz here, but I have fabulous graduate students and members of my team that work with me on it. And what we did was we examined the impact that these trials had on 3 outcomes: human rights, and by that we meant very specifically executions, torture, disappearances, and imprisonment. We looked at the impact on democracy, and we looked at the impact on conflict. In these areas, we're using existing measures that social scientists routinely use. I didn't have to go out and create all these measures too. Then we were able to do the quantitative analysis, also controlling for other things that we know lead to human rights violations, like poverty, large population. And essentially what we found was that, if you're in a transitional country and you have a single year of human rights prosecutions, it doesn't make a difference. So but when we have cumulative prosecutions, that is 2 years or more, when we have kind of a more persistent effort of accountability, we do see that that's associated with a decline in this measure that measures torture, disappearances, executions, and imprisonment. And so we see the trials are associated with improvements. That effect doubles when there are guilty verdicts. This suggests that deterrence is at work. In other words, it's not just the trials that are working, but if there's actually going to be punishment. And it suggests that state officials are paying attention to the costs, the incentives and the disincentives. And if you can impose some costs on these state officials, you can actually lead to a decline in repression. We do not find evidence that trials undermine democracy. Rather, they are associated with more robust democracies. And finally, very interesting finding on conflict, we do see this short-term effect where if you have a prosecution, in 1 year later, there is this association with increased conflict. But if you have the cumulative, again, 2 years or more, we see that trials are associated with decline in conflict, with conflict non-recurrence, as I say. So this is important to us because it has key policy implications. And that is that human rights prosecutions are not a panacea. They're not going to solve all your problems if you're a transitional society. They're not going to move human rights violations down to zero. But they are one essential part of the toolkit that these transitional societies can and should use to try to deter human rights crimes in the future. The efforts at accountability should be persistent, but they do not have to be comprehensive. Sometimes people think that I'm saying you have to prosecute every single one of the people who's responsible. And yet we find that countries that have had delayed and partial justice still can see a positive impact as long as they do persist more than a couple of years. Of course, trials are not the only kind of mechanism, transitional justice mechanism. Countries do lots of other things as well. I have some of them listed here. And our next stage is we're gathering data on all of these other kinds of transitional justice mechanisms. So we want to find out not only do trials work, what happens if you have a truth commission? Does that make a difference? Does that also contribute? What happens if you provide reparations for victims of human rights violations? And so our next stage, then, and this is the Kara Center strategy for to address transitional justice in this broader way, is our strategic goal is really to try to make transitional justice more effective to prevent future human rights violations. And the way we're going to do this is we're already working, we've already had a transitional justice study group going this whole year. Next year we're turning that into a transitional justice working group. We're going to move beyond study, and we're going to work with colleagues here at Harvard, especially people in the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, who are doing also doing interesting work on transitional justice. But also colleagues elsewhere as part of my transitional justice collaborative to write and publish additional research based on our new data. And then we're going to use that research. We're going to use it first in the classroom. We're sharing it with our students. But then we're going to use it to train and to consult with governments, with NGOs, and with international organizations to really try to make their transitional justice work more effective. So this, I think, is an example of making human rights work, what we mean by making human rights work. And that, in this case, using the good social science research to connect it with practitioners to address some of the pressing policy issues of the day.
Thanks, Kathy. As I mentioned earlier, these are 3 topics that we work on, but we do other things. We have other programs. We have a very interesting program on violence against women, in particular a study on whether a special treaty is needed to address the issues of violence against women. CEDAW, the Women's Treaty, has not one mention of the word violence in it. Yet this has been an issue of growing attention around the world. So is a treaty at this point useful, especially when we combine it with studies that have already been made by people like Beth Simmons in the government department at Harvard on the effectiveness of treaties. Therefore, we have a better idea on whether they're worth fighting for in this circumstance. We're looking specifically now on a project with Alberto Mora, who was the legal counsel of the Department of Navy under the first 5 years of the Bush administration, who fought quite valiantly within the administration against the policy on cruelty. And Alberto was here this year as an advanced leadership fellow. And he's working on a project with us to really fully document and understand the costs and consequences of the legal decision to use cruelty. And that means we're not only looking at the question of evidence, but the foreign policy impact, but also the operational impact on our military and on our intelligence gathering efforts. We have a project working on LGBT rights and also on disability rights. We had a study group on disability rights and are moving for our first course here on disability next year. So there's a wide range of issues we're looking at. They all share something in common, which is that they are complex problems that need good analysis, but we also need, as part of that analysis, to understand their supply chains. And those issues are going to change over the years at the Kennedy School, but we will continue to look at particular issues because they provide the arena on which we can work with our students to do what we want, which is, again, to train human rights practitioners, to be more effective, to strategize more effectively, and also to draw on the best social science research to help them find solutions. Our goal is that students come to Kennedy School because they know this will be the place that invests in their strategic capacities, so that when they return, they'll have the tools they need to match their already existing commitments and help reinforce the courage that they need to act in their societies. So that's our program, and we wanted to have enough time for some dialogue with you about the Carr Center work or about the human rights world at this point. So let me open it up. Kathryn, I'll try and respond to. Sir?
Very interesting, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
It strikes me that a lot of the research that you'd be doing would be in the field. And I just wondered, how do you do that with the constraints, financial and otherwise, that you have here at the Carr Center? And to what extent do you have students actually traveling to sites of abuses?
That's a delicate issue because of the need to protect students. And there's also a difference between the policies of Harvard on undergraduates versus graduates versus PhD students and so forth. And so it's actually a question that's somewhat fraught with difficulty. The degree to which we actually will send people into a place of human rights abuses will usually be associated with their summer internships and their decisions to take on a policy writing exercise to an organization in a community where human rights issues occur. That's at least thus far how we've been able to operate, not only because of the lack of funding, certainly, but also not promoting large numbers to go abroad, but very targeted understanding of where it's safest for them to operate.
I just want to say, for example, Siddharth is a really good example of this. We did and he was very careful about research. For example, he made a decision that only he could only have women on one of his research teams, and that was a research team that was able to go and come back from the site in a single day, because he felt it would put them at risk if they had to stay overnight in the areas where they were doing research. We thought he was such a thoughtful, careful researcher, we actually wanted him to teach a course for us on qualitative research methods for our students. But I do want to say sometimes the research is not dangerous. Building my data set, people have been doing fantastic research around the world on this trial, on that trial, but no one had ever put it together in a single database that let us answer this question: do trials work in the aggregate, and not just does this trial in Argentina work? And so some of the research can be dangerous. A lot of it doesn't have to be.
Yes. I'm Nelson Ortiz from Venezuela. And,
please do introduce yourself. Yes.
And one of the things that I have noticed in Venezuela is that a lot of people talk about the necessity to go to an amnesty or an era of forgiveness and try to copy the South African model or El Salvador model, that kind of things where you forgive and you forget what happened and just try to look forward. And what is happening is that the people that are in power, they feel that that diminishes their cost of doing wrong things. Because if they know that at the end there will be that kind of amnesty, and a lot of people it's working towards that, so why would they stop? So what's your criteria on that? To balance, go to the trial model and the truth commission and all that, and just try that that crimes must be punished versus looking forward and forget the past.
So we do have amnesty data, and I'm reporting on very, very recent research. Okay, so it's really just still unpublished research. But what we're finding is that trials are doing the work of improving human rights. They can be combined with partial amnesties, as long as those amnesties do not totally prevent trials. Okay, and so some people say, and I very recently say, we want to amnesty child soldiers, for example, because why should they be held? They themselves are victims. Why that we have to protect them, or sometimes certain kinds of lower level officials. And so it is possible to combine trials with partial amnesties, as long as you still have persistent efforts at accountability, and especially higher level people who are really the masterminds behind it. But what needs to be avoided at all costs are blanket amnesties that create impunity and that block trials.
I want to also comment from a different point of view. The first modern truth commission, as I understand it, was set up by Idi Amin, and that he killed 2 of the members and the 3rd went into exile. So it was a new tool that began to develop, and one place it developed was in Argentina, where in order to avoid trials, President Alfonsín established a truth commission. But it created such a political ferment within the country to have this document that the political pressure built on him, and then the military did a number of stupid things that led to their own trial. But what this is an example in my mind is where a new tactic is developed, and lacking alternatives, it spreads quickly, because it's the only other thing people can think of to do at a time. So it dispersed very broadly without necessarily understanding the conditions or the procedures that actually made it an effective tool. And so, like you said, it's become part of the holy word on that you can't move anything forward unless you have a truth commission. But it's also been easily manipulable as a tactic. So in general, I think we all have a human tendency to look for something new and innovative, but to overload the tactic with capabilities it's simply not able to carry. And that's one of those where, at this point, I think we need to be supportive, but skeptical about truth commissions and their impact. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. My name is Elena, and I have an MPA from 2000 from here. So just earlier this week, I was in Atlanta, and I was telling people I was coming to this event, and I mentioned I was going to talk on human trafficking. And somebody mentioned that to 5 people, every single one of them who said, "Oh yes, Atlanta is the hub here in the United States for human trafficking. We have a really big problem with it." And I've just been thinking about, at the beginning you said, contemporary forms of slavery are equal to human trafficking, and that it's a supply chain problem. And I've just been trying to wrap my mind around what's going on in Atlanta, how this happens here in the United States, and it's like, and it would still apply that it's a supply chain, or like where's the demand part of that too, and what's really going on here?
I want to say a couple things. One is, Siddharth, first is, we don't know exactly in the United States yet where the hubs are. In fact, Siddharth has said he wants to do more research in the United States. He could do it, and he would do it in Los Angeles, not in Atlanta. But I also thought we should maybe, we have Charlie Clements here, many of you know him, the executive director of the Carr Center, who has been working with Siddharth on this, and I'm really, Charlie would like to answer that question.
Well, we know that trafficking is really pervasive in every American city, both labor trafficking and sex trafficking. Under the guise of, if you go to a place called Backpage, you can find hundreds of escort services, hundreds of massage parlors. Many of the women in these services, and a few men, are victims of trafficking of some kind, meaning that force, fraud, or coercion was used to get them in those situations to extract their labor in some form. We've only really had a federal trafficking law for 7 years. It's fairly new. We only had one in Massachusetts for 2 years. Prosecutions for trafficking are few and far between. The federal government has set up the trafficking in persons, the TIP program, and set up task forces that teach law enforcement how do you use cyber. Many of these transactions today take place solely across cell phones. So construction workers from Central America are working in Atlanta will call up on a cell phone, and a panel truck will come up with a woman in the back, and 5 construction workers will have sex with this woman in the back of the panel truck and be gone. That's happening throughout the United States. Law enforcement really don't know how to document cyber trafficking. What is admissible in court? How do they capture those moments? So we have a long ways to go. I think that where we've seen these federal task forces, which really combine people dealing with survivors, trying to get them in rehabilitation. For them to testify, they have to be granted immunity from deportation, which is a complex issue. How we assist prosecutors who may not have assistance with this, and how federal laws interact with local laws are all part of that equation. But I think that we do see a positive trend in all of this, and much more attention to it than there was, say, 5 years ago.
In terms of Atlanta itself, the speculation I've seen on it is as a major transportation hub of the country. And that tends to be where the largest grouping on trafficking comes. But it is important to underscore that we're talking not only about sex trafficking, but many forms of labor trafficking, even in the United States. Bill.
Bill Clark on the faculty here. So this is very exciting. Looks like you're not going to be bored for work to do. But fast forward 5 years. So I know you guys are just starting up this round at the center. Help me try to figure out what you figure the most distinctive, useful, interesting niche for a Center on Human Rights at Harvard at the Kennedy School could be 5 years out. What would be distinctive about it, especially with regard to the interface between research, engagement with practice, and training, and what's standing in the way of being there already?
What I'd like to say, I think this model up here that we just put up, I think that this is a very distinctive model, okay? I don't think it's happening anywhere in this country. That is this combination of teaching people to think and act more strategically, And as part of that, really drawing on social science research. So the social science research it combines with the strategic thinking. Now, and so that means issues can change, and we don't know exactly what the exact new issues will be that will arise. But we think this model will be there in 5 years because we think it's distinctive and we think it makes a real contribution. You know, the human rights centers in law schools around the country, they aren't doing this, or they're doing it in a very narrow way, which is just about law. How can law be applied to problems? Where we have a much broad, you see this, we have this broad set of tactics that we want to get people to think about. And we're drawing much more on social science research, though we're teaching people law as well. So,
yes, I think that currently there's no place in the world that human rights people go specifically to study strategy. And on one level, I think that's a very weird situation. But the truth of the matter is that where strategy is taught is in the War College, to the military, and increasingly in business schools. And they have entirely different kinds of strategic programs or strategic planning methods which really don't fit each other very well. Mike Posner was here early in the semester as part of our speaker series on the Obama human rights policy, the unfinished agenda. Mike is the founder of what was the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights, now Human Rights First. Spent the first 4 years of the Obama administration running the human rights program in the State Department. He described meetings with human rights people where they were very detailed in describing the problem. They could bring up new evidence on a new victim, etc. But when asked, what do we do about it? He said, no matter what the issue, there were two things. Have the president make a statement and develop economic sanctions. And he said he began to feel desperate for ideas, and what he told our students at that time is he felt the lack of effective strategizing was at a crisis proportion in the human rights world. So I think that this is the niche that needs to be filled. Certainly the one I felt as a practitioner, that there was no place to go for doing that. And in particular then there was no place to go to find collaborative leaders in other organizations that thought strategically sufficiently that they could combine resources to be more effective. I believe that one of the chief strategic skills is the ability to develop collaborations, and that if we can make headway in teaching that, but in particular recognizing the strengths that already exist at the Kennedy School in training to management, but in training to leadership, that we can unite with those strengths and specifically tailor them to the needs of the human rights movement. That's distinctive. It just doesn't exist anywhere in the world, and I've been looking for about 10 years for that. The technical map is not distinct because the CBT has been using it for 15 years and it's trained hundreds of organizations around the world. And yet it was new to all of the students in our class and was useful as a tool. So we'll continue to use that. I'm glad to see that the United Nations in their new training manual basically used this whole technique, but they called it something else. But I know where they got it because I spent many various visits to the High Commissioner's office when we first developed this concept. So I think that's also something that's distinct. In particular, if we can unite with Harvard to try and create a more digital, database-driven system, a tool that we can get out and spread to human rights practitioners around the world. So I think I would say that the vision of trying to create a place in the world where human rights people who want to study strategy can come. That will make the Carr Center and the Kennedy School unique in the world.
And what's the right size of a center to occupy that niche?
That's a great question. At this school, you know,
It's not allowed to be bigger than the school.
I don't know that yet. And I know how many empty desks are in the Carr Center that I don't have the funding to fill with fellows and with other professors. But I'm also used to having to build things over time. That's the only way it operates. Yes, I would like to be able to recruit 2 or 3 more practitioner professors to be part of this. But we first of all have to demonstrate that we can attract the students and create the programs that they actually need. But in particular, to find some younger ones that I can work with, because I'm also getting up there, and I need to make sure that when I leave, there's something behind.
One last extension, then I'll be quiet. So I should know this, but one of the things other centers have done precisely to be able to attract the best students they can is build up, especially under David, fellowship support for student applicants, particularly directed to those wanting to concentrate in this area. Do you guys have those yet?
No, and I would say that's a big priority. We just had the experience of 3 very interesting human rights applicants who received Mason fellowships with no money. And we scraped up $20,000 from our budget and offered it to a young person from Colombia. It wasn't enough. So we turned it to a young person, a mid-career person in Sierra Leone, and it wasn't enough. And so we went to the 3rd, and it wasn't enough for him either. By that point, it was pretty clear it wasn't enough. Because human rights people anywhere in the world don't make a lot of money, but in Sierra Leone, they really can't afford the tuition. So it's a major priority, in particular if we want to have an effect in the world of practice, then we need to have ways of either bringing people here or getting there over time. So we'll experiment with online courses, we'll experiment with executive education programs that are more short-term, and look for donors who could support particular people from the developing world or transitional justice communities. But for the long term, if we could establish a human rights fellowship that would let us identify good practitioners or academics from Colombia or elsewhere who do human rights work, to bring them here to help supplement our work for a year, to encourage good social science research. There's so many uses for fellows, and we've had many fellows here that have done a lot of work with no compensation. The honor of being a fellow at Harvard, I'm new here, I'm still amazed by it, that they come and work for nothing for a year. But that's a limited group of people, and it doesn't allow us ourselves to target who we want, what issue we want to work on, and how to move them forward. So it's got to be a priority, money for fellowships, money for scholarships, as well as the work we do on providing funding for students to go into places where there's summer internships, work with the Human Rights Group, and design their thesis, their final thesis, that's useful to the group that they work with. That's a tremendous resource in the world to have, a team of 2 or 3 Harvard students working over a year period to investigate an issue and come up with a set of recommendations. So I need obviously to learn how to make that work, being still too new, and requiring your mentorship.
Has the Carr Center either alone in collaboration with other human rights institutions defined these abuses, particularly torture? And I ask that because I've read in this post 9/11 world about congressmen and congresswomen and government officials in the United States who don't have apparently a common understanding of what are torture methods and waterboarding is one example.
Right. Some of that is willful ignorance, and some of it is exploitive self-protection. Waterboarding is clearly torture, and there's no doubt in the minds either of the human rights community or in the minds of the international systems that have been established to monitor torture. Everyone has declared it a form of torture. It's only the United States.
Well, we should also say on previous occasions, when waterboarding, before 9/11, when waterboarding is used by foreign governments, the United States explicitly said that that waterboarding was a form of torture when it was used by foreign governments. If it were used against our own soldiers, we would condemn it as torture. And so this is the double standard, is that we use that word when it's being used by other governments, but we don't call it torture when we ourselves use it.
That's part of the importance of the project that we'll be doing on looking at the costs and consequences, because it has been justified as an effective way of getting information. And essentially it's been justified as a tactic while ignoring the strategic implications of it. So our program is going to really outline the strategic costs to the United States of this program, because we think it's going to be pretty clear that so little was gained, but so much was lost, that if we were rational, we would bury that. But it's of course not rationality that in the end affects policy, unfortunately, and the way people think about torture. Before this was announced as a policy, Americans were roughly 72% believing that torture should never be used. Now we're down to like 48%. There's been an incredible decline in this moral standard for the United States, and that's alarming to the rest of the world, as it should be alarming to us. So we tried at Center for Victims of Torture saying, look, we know from working with victims of torture that these are all torture. Why? Because we know the effects of it. We can measure what will be the after effects of these different forms of abuse and cruelty, and they look like other kinds of effects from similar methods. And I think one of the things we really have to underscore is that we were available, and the treatment movement that we helped build across the country was available, that if they wanted to know what was torture or not, they just had to ask. Which is really curious, because when the Center for Victims of Torture was much smaller, Kathryn's trying to convince me to quit saying we, because I left. But when the center was...
We the Carr Center, yes.
Yeah. When the Center for Victims of Torture was much smaller, back in 1992, President Bush I had developed a strategy to develop a global campaign to end torture by the year 2000. And they moved and invited us in to consult with us how to do it. But looking back, what was totally remarkable is their big concern was that people would think that if the goal is ending torture by the year 2000, people would misinterpret them to think that torture was okay until the year 2000. And they wanted to make sure they were communicating that torture was always wrong under all circumstances. What they were talking about was a political, economic leadership by the United States to find an end torture in the world. So the administration had an opportunity to to consult. But essentially, it was filled with people who didn't understand the argument. They didn't understand foreign policy, they didn't understand the military issues, and people in the administration who did understand them, who argued against it, like Judge Morrow, like Will Taft for the State Department, who just ignored.
So I just want to check, there is a closing reception in the forum that starts at 2:30. So we do want to end the formal session now, but we want to let you know that we will stay in when there's any additional questions. We'd love to talk to you more about it. So we're not rushing away to the closing session, but in case you need to, we'll end the session here.
We'd like to thank you for being here, and in particular, as you think about the Capitol campaign, think about human rights and help us struggle within the overall institution to